When most people hear the name Sun Tzu, they immediately think of war. They think of generals. They think of armies. And of course, they think of those famous strategy quotes constantly shared across social media. Today, Sun Tzu is often portrayed as a philosopher of victory, as if he were a thinker who unlocked the secrets of human psychology and discovered the hidden formula for winning wars. But what if I told you that this is largely a misunderstanding? Because Sun Tzu's true obsession was not winning wars. In fact, it may have been the exact opposite. His real obsession was avoiding war, more precisely, avoiding the cost of war. And that is what makes him one of the most fascinating thinkers in history. Because during Sun Tzu's lifetime, states were not only fighting their enemies, in many ways they were fighting their own economies as well. During the 6th and 5th centuries BC, China was divided into numerous competing states. Every ruler wanted more power. Each believed that by defeating the rivals, they could unite the entire land under their rule. But there was a price, and that price grew larger every year. Armies expanded, more soldiers were needed, more weapons were required, more grain, more horses, and more taxes became necessary. When a king sent his army into the field, he was not merely starting a war, he was also borrowing against his future, because war was expensive. And even when it was won, the bill often had to be paid for years afterward. Today, we like to tell stories of war as tales of heroism. But the reality was very different. The moment an army began to move, it began spending money. Soldiers had to be fed, horses had to be supplied, weapons had to be produced, roads had to be protected. And the cost of all of it increased with every passing day. For a small state, even a few months of warfare could be disastrous. For a large state, a prolonged conflict could push it to the brink of bankruptcy. This was the world Sun Tzu lived in, and it is why we often make a major mistake when reading The Art of War. Because the word war appears in the title, we assume that the book teaches people how to fight. But if you look carefully, you discover something very different. Sun Tzu keeps asking the same question. What is the cost of this war? And perhaps even more importantly, how can we avoid paying that cost? Maybe that is why the most famous line of the book is this: "The greatest victory is the one won without fighting." Most people read this as strategic advice, but it is also an economic strategy. Because when you win without fighting, you lose no soldiers, you drain no treasury, and you avoid years of economic destruction. For Sun Tzu, victory mattered, but cost mattered even more. Because in his view, if defeating the enemy requires exhausting the treasury, then it can hardly be called a victory. In fact, when you read The Art of War from beginning to end, you begin to notice something interesting. The book is not filled with battle scenes. It does not tell heroic stories. It does not praise commanders chasing glory and fame. Instead, it constantly talks about logistics. It talks about supply. It talks about information. And above all, it talks about cost. Because Sun Tzu recognized a simple truth that many leaders failed to see. Money lost on the battlefield can sometimes be more dangerous than soldiers lost on the battlefield. A state can replace soldiers. A collapsed economy may take decades to recover. That is why Sun Tzu's greatest weapon was not the sword. It was information. What we would call intelligence today. Spies, information networks, knowledge of the enemy's plans. Because in his view, accurate information was worth more than thousands of soldiers. Think about it. If you know what your enemy is planning, if you knew where they intend to strike, if you understand the weaknesses in their army, You may never have to fight at all. And if you do not fight, you do not spend. That was Sun Tzu's logic. To him, information was an investment that reduced costs. In many ways, this is also why modern governments spend billions building intelligence agencies. Because bad information is expensive. Sometimes expensive enough to lose a war. Sometimes expensive enough to destroy an economy. Another concept that Sun Tzu valued deeply was speed. One of his most famous sayings is, "Speed is the essence of war." Most people interpret this as a call for aggression, but there is an economic logic behind it as well. Because every additional day increases costs, armies consume food, horses consume supplies, treasuries shrink, taxes rise, production declines. And slowly the state begins consuming its own strength. That is why Sun Tzu favored short wars. Moving quickly was not merely a military advantage, it was an economic advantage. The less time you spend, the fewer resources you consume. And the fewer resources you consume, the easier it becomes to recover when the conflict is over. Perhaps that is why Sun Tzu's ideas have survived for more than 2,000 years. Because what he was really talking about was not just war. It was resource management. It was risk management. Today, a business executive faces similar questions. So does a president. So does an investor. Because in every area of life, the same question appears. How many resources are you willing to spend to achieve your goal? And is that goal truly worth the cost? That is where Sun Tzu's real genius lies. He viewed victory as the outcome, but he viewed cost as the starting point, because in his view any plan created without calculating its cost would eventually end in disaster. History proved him right. Throughout the centuries, many states won wars, yet they lost economically. Many empires were not crushed by their enemies. They were crushed by their own spending. We saw it during the later years of Rome, we saw it in the Spanish Empire, we saw it during certain periods of the Ottoman Empire. And we continue to see the same story repeated in the modern world. Because while technology changes, mathematics does not. War remains expensive. Power still requires resources. And economic reality remains stronger than anyone wishes to admit. What makes Sun Tzu's ideas so remarkable is that they do not merely explain his own era. They remain relevant today. Because modern states continue making the same mistakes he warned about. Think about it. Some of the most powerful nations of the 20th century struggled, not because they lacked military strength. They struggled because of the cost of war. The Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan is one example. Years of conflict did more than cost lives. It weakened the economy. It consumed resources. And it created a burden larger than the state could comfortably carry. The United States faced similar challenges in Vietnam and later conflicts. What did these wars have in common? The problem was not military weakness. It was resource depletion. Sun Tzu would probably not have been surprised, because his warning was simple. Prolonged wars can consume a state faster than its enemies ever could, and often, the greatest threat is not outside the borders. It is inside them. When the treasury begins to empty, when debt begins to grow, when production weakens, even the strongest armies stop being a solution. This is why Sun Tzu never viewed war as merely a military issue. To him, it was also an economic decision, perhaps the most expensive decision a state can make, and the consequences often appear long after the war itself has ended. Today, the world's great powers still face the same equation: defense budgets, debt burdens, supply chains, energy resources, economic resilience. The names have changed, The technology has changed. But the fundamental problem remains the same. How long can a state sustain its power? Because in Sun Tzu's eyes, true power was never the size of your army. It was your ability to keep that army standing. Real strength is not measured by how hard you can strike, but by how long you can afford to keep striking. Perhaps that is why The Art of War is still read today, because the book is not really about war. It is a book about resources. It is a book about limits. It is a book about cost. And most importantly, it is a book about how to remain strong without destroying yourself in the process. Sun Tzu did not glorify victory. He glorified stability. He did not glorify conquest. He glorified sustainability. In his view, a ruler who conquered cities was not necessarily wise, but a ruler who preserved resources was. A general who destroyed armies was not necessarily great, but a general who won without fighting was, because true wisdom is not only knowing when to act, it is knowing when not to act. And perhaps that is the most important lesson Sun Tzu gave the world more than 2,500 years ago. States do not always collapse because of the wars they lose. Sometimes they collapse because of the wars they win. Because throughout history many nations were not destroyed by their enemies. They were destroyed by exhausting their own resources. And that is why Sun Tzu's message remains relevant today. Strength is not measured by how hard you strike. It is measured by how long you can sustain that strength. And when a state ignores the cost of its decisions, sooner or later it pays the price. Because even if history does not repeat itself, it continues sending the same bill to those who refuse to understand it. If this video gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe. Because here at the Financial Memory, we'll continue exploring the stories where money, power, and human behavior intersect. And sometimes we'll discover that even a thinker who lived more than 2,000 years ago can still help us understand the world we live in today.